which I visited in 2010, and they have a non primary school or elementary school and a C.S. Lewis High School. And I've never met students, hundreds of them, who knew Lewis work so well, you know. But anyway, I was there for something like several days, uh, and and deeply moved by their kindness. They had just come out from communism, and they had to fight for everything that they believed, you know. But anyway, before I left, they allowed the young students, high school students, to ask me questions. And the last question I was asked, how she understood it, I don't quite know. But anyway, this young girl said to me, how does it feel having lived your life under the shadow of someone else? Well, I won't tell you what I said quite yet, but I think many people do get that impression, including me. But I'm, it's been a shadow that's lasted a long time. I mean, I'm very lucky to have lived this long. I'm 85 now, and anyway, I remember the exact, you know, when I remember things well, maybe the same, I remember the chair I was sitting in or the tree I was leaning up against or something, when I really make a real discovery that counts. And I remember, you know, where I was and how even the page looked when I found at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I'm from North Carolina. I read C.S. Lewis's introduction to Letters to Young Churches by J.B. Phillips. It was very, very popular at that time. Maybe you don't know it. But anyway, it was the way he expressed himself and the way he talked about the scriptures and about the apostles and all that. And I remember saying, he really believes, to my friends, he really believes. They said, well, we really believe too. So what makes him different from us? And then over the years, I think, yes, he really believed, but he believed in a way with the certainty that I think St. Peter and St. Paul did, who knew him, Christ. I think of that, you know. Anyway, I wanted to read whatever I could lay my hands on. And I was having to go into the army because that was the time of the Korean crisis, it was played out really. There was not much to do, but all men were being, you know, the dropper would give you 2 more weeks or another term. Anyway, I just managed to finish my degree before I had to go into the army. And I met these 2 elderly women who ran a bookshop in Greensboro. And they said, we like to put the right books in the right hands. And so we've already got 1 book of Lewis's, Miracles. You can have that right now, but we'll send you whatever we find of C.S. Lewis's. So anyway, I went into the army with Miracles inside my jacket. And, you know, through basic training, you know, climbing under barbed wire and all of that, that book somehow stayed with me all that time, jumping up and down, and no sergeant told me to take that book out. And but they had cigarette breaks about every hour. You'd have a 10-minute break. And I used that to read a paragraph or so of C.S. Lewis. I loved it. I remember even the pine root I was sitting on when I came across some really great moments in it. Anyway, when I was free and of basic training, then wrote a letter to C.S. Lewis, and that was 1954, before you were born, and I wanted him to just, I think, like most of the people who write to him, I simply wanted to tell him how much I enjoyed it, how much it meant. And I think he knew that, and he wrote back and he said, I'm glad if I've been an instrument of the Lord's help to you. In his hands, any instrument will do, otherwise none. Even in our sins, we should look no longer than to know and to regret them, because they're not a proper object of contemplation. When a man comes under the divine meridian, he loses his consciousness of self, and then he in turn becomes an open room which God and our fellow creatures help to fill, while he in turn helps to fill them. But how far from this one is at present. Anyway, then right after that, I'm not sure how many of you will know who Bob Jones Jr. is. You know, Bob Jones Jr. was the president of Bob Jones Jr. University.
We have quite a number of Southerners here.
Oh, yeah. Well, I met
him.
I
think Josh and I may be the only Yankees.
Yeah.
Okay, you got another.
Well, South Carolina. That's right. Well, he was at Fort Jackson, Fort Bragg, to give a sermon, and he understood he knew the King James Version by heart. I believe he did, because when he preached to the men, the soldiers, he just didn't. His text was not a verse; it was the whole of First Thessalonians. He quoted the whole thing. But anyway, I then met him alone. I was terrified, you know. But I heard that he had met C.S. Lewis. So I said, I understand you met C.S. Lewis. What was he like? And he said, you know, that man smokes a pipe, and that man drinks ale, but I do believe he is a Christian. So high praise really from here. And anyway, I continued to write to Lewis. Then in 1962 or 3, I was teaching at the University of Kentucky, and I was working on a book about him, and I asked him if we could meet. And he said, yes, we'll meet, you know. And I think he probably had in mind just meeting one time, you know. If I were him, I wouldn't have committed myself to more meetings than one. And so anyway, I was to come here at this house. I had just arrived here, and on a Friday, and he expected me on Monday, but people said, who knew, it was a very difficult house to find, because it was not this road leading up to it, but it was a different road, of which I took photographs of it, slightly different road, and this was all just agricultural land. This was just geese were living in all of that front part. You wouldn't have known anybody lived here. Anyway, he said, go up that road and you'll find him. But I still could not find it. So they sent me to his housekeeper, and she told me how to get here. Anyway, I arrived here that Friday afternoon, and 4 o'clock, and it was tea time, and Lewis took his tea seriously. He invited me in, and I liked him at once. And we had a pot of tea. Then he went back in the kitchen and made another pot of tea, and then another pot of tea. Well, I didn't know. I had been here only about 24 hours. I didn't know that in English homes the lavatory and the bathroom are two separate rooms. And so I said, Professor Lewis, do you think I could use the bathroom? He said, certainly, you may. He took me into what had a bathtub in it. And he took out about 3 or 4 towels and stacked them up. He brought about 4 or 5 tablets of soap and put all that there. He said, you think you'll have enough for your bath? And I said, I'm sure I will. Well, I thought, what do I do? He closed the door behind me. Oh, what do you do? Well, I was tempted to do something I didn't do. So finally I went back out there and I said, Professor Lewis, actually it wasn't a bath I wanted. Well, he was roaring with laughter. He knew that. And he said, that will cure you of those American euphemisms. So now let's start all over again. Where do you want to go? Well, it was a wonderful afternoon. It was a great icebreaker. It just meant, I was really comfortable with him then. But I remember, to be in his company is to always be he was always making distinctions. And I remember one clear distinction he made, a very important one, that afternoon, was that I had asked him, which of your books do you think is best? And he says, I think probably Perelandra is best. And then he said, now I would like to ask you, which do you think, which of the books do you like the most? And I said, well, I agree with you that Perelandra is best. He said, no, see, that was your question, but my question was different. Which is not which you think best, but what you like the most. And I said, oh, in that case, I like That Hideous Strength more than any book in the world. And he says, see, don't you see? One thing could be, to your mind, best, but another you like most. You don't have to like the things that you necessarily think are the best. Anyway, to just be in his company was clarification enough. But anyway, it was sad that it ended, and he was going to take me up to the Ampleforth Arms, where we had a pint, and then he was going to put me on the bus. And my heart was simply breaking. I wish I hadn't come, because I really liked him so much. I thought on the way there, I really love this man. I've been thinking about him all these years, but I know I met him, and he was beyond anything I've ever thought of. And my heart was breaking. But so as I was getting on the bus, I almost was crying, and I said, Professor Lewis, thank you very much. Oh, you're not getting away. You're not getting away. You're coming to the Inkling meetings on Monday. So I wasn't seeing him for the last time. So I went to the Inkling meeting, which was at that time in the Lamb and Flag, across from the Bird and the Baby. And Lewis by no means did all the talking. It was like Falstaff and Shakespeare. He was not only witty in himself, but the cause of wit in other men. And he caused everybody, including me, to say things he was trying in one way to bring me out. And so I said something, and then people were asked to say something about that. But it was a brilliant, wonderful conversation, which he made possible. You can't have that sort of thing without C.S. Lewis in it. Anyway, I thought, oh God, I'm going through this again. I thought this is probably the last time I'll see him. Anyway, I thought I was being very clever. He let down and gave a coin to a beggar who was sitting on the corner there. And I said that I just picked up the traditional thing. Aren't you afraid if you that he'll spend it on drink? And Louis says, well, if I kept it, I would. So then I thought, this is the end. And he said, oh, no, you're not getting away. You're coming back to the Kilns on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, we would talk and go to the Six Bells for a pint of beer and spend really the afternoon together. And then when I was again afraid, he said, oh, no, you're not getting away. You're coming back on Sunday morning because we're going to church together, and then you're coming back here for breakfast, which I'm going to cook. And so it went on. 3 times a week we were meeting until about 3 weeks later, I came here one Sunday morning to find that he was not dressed, and he really was ill. I didn't understand this, but he had had for several years infected kidney and infected prostate gland, but they will normally have operated on somebody like that would even here, but they thought his heart was too weak for such an operation. So he had to live on a low protein diet with these blood transfusions occasionally. So anyway, he was having to go into the hospital the next day. So he said he knew, but I knew nothing about his brother except that his brother, Warnie, had been helping him as a secretarial help because he needed so much help. He spent over 2 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week, on correspondence, because he felt that if you publish a book, well, you can write a book, but you don't have to publish a book. But if you do, you're responsible for the people who write to you and ask you questions, because you put that thought in their mind. They didn't bring it up. You brought it up. So you are responsible. So he felt he should, in decency, reply to all those letters. But his hand was getting too rheumatic, and he needed help. So he said, would you be willing to give up your job and stay with me as my secretary? And so he said, we'll start right away because I'm going to the hospital, but bring all the letters with you, because he worked throughout all of that time in the hospital. And it was a wonderful time. He smoked a lot, but the hospital didn't want beds to catch on fire, so he would say, I want you to bring me some cigarettes and leave your matches. So I did. And then, when I went back, the nurses would say, what is happening? Somebody is bringing him cigarettes. And what about those matches? We're afraid he's going to catch fire and burn himself up. Well, who does that? Do you know? And I said, I do. And they said, but why? And I said, because I can't resist him anything. He said, well, you better resist him this time because he'll burn himself up. So then they went in and took away his cigarettes and matches. So when I went in, he said, do you know why they came in and took away my cigarette and matches? And I said, because I told them, Benedict Arnold. Finally, the truth is out. See, Benedict Arnold, the betrayer. But I did save him from burning the hospital up. Anyway, when he came home again, it was simply wonderful. One of the things that we did together is that he didn't want to work all the time, and he was retiring now from Cambridge. And is that something I've never met before, but which he and his brother Warnie did a lot, which is to simply sit together reading their different books, or just doing separate things, but together. He liked the company of another person. So Jack Lewis would say, "Didn't you bring your book, Walter?" Then he would start reading his. So, but it was very comfortable, you know. You don't have to be talking, but you do like one another's company. And it was wonderful company. When we talked, his conversation was very much like his books. You know, everything he writes is in the first person. Even the Narnian stories, you know, if I ever know any more about this, I'll tell you about it. You know? So the Narnian stories are one of the things. He didn't really particularly like talking about his own works, but he did agree with me that Narnia was successful, and that the best character in it was based on his gardener, Paxford here. Puddleglum is the one who is, but Paxford was as gloomy as Puddleglum. He was a very kind, good man, but he thought the world was ending, and he was the one who sent to buy the groceries. And if he could find somebody to share a half-pound a bag of sugar with him, he would get that person to share it with him, because he didn't want, as he said, to have a lot of sugar in this house if the end of the world came. And I said, well, what difference would it make if the world ends, whether it's in Headington or here? He said, it makes a lot of difference to me, because I'm responsible to God for where it is, you know. So, but I said, we've got somebody important coming to see Mr. Jack on Monday, and I've already counted up the spoons of sugar, and there's only enough for him. He said, well, the guest may not take it. But I said, but if he does, what are we going to do? He said, we'll just have to do with that, because we can't have sugar in the house if the end of the world happens. and many elderly women, I say, or I would see them stop outside the Kilns if Paxford was there, and sort of admire him. And so I knew that there were a number of widow ladies that he could have married if he wanted to. But I asked him, do you think you'll marry? And he had a poem. I've never been able to trace it, but he quoted it all the time. A little puff of powder, a little touch of paint makes a woman look like just what she ain't. So that was his. I mean, if you ask why aren't you married, a little puff of powder, little touch of paint makes a woman look like just what she ain't. Anyway, Lewis was easygoing. His wonderful conversation about simply everything. But I wanted him to have some rest, that he had retired from Cambridge. And what would happen is that after lunch, he would have either tea or coffee, and then I would leave him alone in that first room, the common room, as he called it. But I wonder whether he took a nap. I didn't know, but I was dying to find out. I tried looking through the keyhole, but I couldn't see anything. So finally, the only thing to do was to ask him, Jack, you know, when I leave the room, do you take a nap? Oh, no, he said. Mind you, sometime a nap takes me. And that, I realize, is the nature of naps. They do the taking. You don't take them, they take you. So if you put on your pajamas at 1 o'clock and got into bed and all that and closed the curtain, nothing would happen. No, naps are in charge. But everything he said was interesting. He was giving away so much that it really alarmed me. But I had discovered from Owen Barfield that beginning in 1941, that may not mean anything to you chronologically, but that is the year that the screw tape letters were being published in a journal, one by one. And it was also the year of the first broadcast, Mere Christianity broadcast, that first series, 1941. Well, Lewis wouldn't take any money from any of those. He already had a list of widows and orphans, remember St. James? Widows and orphans to whom each of the checks was to be sent. Something like £3 for each letter, or £3 for each broadcast. But he didn't keep any of it himself. And so what happened at the end of that year, he had made so much money from that he owed a lot of tax. He hadn't thought of that. And so he wrote to Owen Barfield, who was then a solicitor, saying, what am I going to do? I don't have all this money. I gave it all away. And so Owen Barfield said, I think, I have an idea. After that, Lewis gave the money into what he called an agape fund, love fund, to be given people anonymously. It was never known that it was coming from C.S. Lewis. So after a while, what he did is that he made, not just giving away the money from religion, but 2/3 of his income. 2/3 of his total income was going from 1941 up until 1960 when he got married, or 57, until he stopped at 57 because he needed money for his wife who was dying. And then when she died in 1960, then he resumed it again until he died. But I thought, I've never been in a poor house, The housekeeper told me that when she arrived here in 1952, the blackout curtains were still up after the war. And she said, but the war's been over a lot of years. But we got the blackout curtains up. He said, there's no point in spending money on curtains. She said, would you mind if I wash them? Oh, that's all right. So she washed this old black material, and it just turned into ink. So you had to just pour it out. There was no cloth there at all. So she got new curtains. Big. But he didn't have any ashtrays, He said he just flipped a cigarette across the carpet, saying at the same time, ashes are good for carpets, but only men believe it. He was a wonderful company, but he was worried about his brother, who, since 1947, was going to a place in Ireland which he really loved so he could drink. And the first time he did that, in 47, he ended up in a hospital, Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, run by these wonderful nuns. They looked after him. But so oftentimes, if he just was hungry for drink, he just went to Drogheda. But I was asked to come over a number of times after Lewis died to get him from there. But this was Lewis's big worry, you know. It had been joy, but it was also warning. And there was simply nothing he can do. He did all he could. And the brother had periods of sobriety and in which he did good things. He wrote 7 books. So he was a wonderful man with this weakness which he gave into. But anyway, the time came that I had to go back to teach 1 term to in the University of Kentucky before I could resign and then come back here. So all of our correspondence was about, you know, what we were changing, we were making things that I'm going to help him to do and all that. And then I was bumped into one of my colleagues on the 22nd of November 1963, and he told me that President Kennedy had just been shot. And so we waited all that day, and then we heard that he had died. So horrible, horrible day. But I just got in bed with that dreadful news when Douglas Gresham, the stepson of Lewis, rang me with the news that Jack Lewis had died the same hour as President Kennedy. But anyway, I then, after that, didn't know what to do. Until I had a letter from from Austin Farrer, the warden of Keble, who he and his wife were great friends of C.S. Lewis. And they said, we feel very strongly that you should come back because there is a work for you to do here. So I did. And I stayed with them in Wheaton, Keble College for a good many months. Anyway, I came out to meet and met Warnie, and he could not have been nicer. And he invited me. He was moving and leaving gave me a lot of manuscripts. He said, I would be happy if you would edit Jack's writings. Well, it wasn't really up to him. It was really up to the 2 trustees of Lewis's estate, Owen Barfield and Cecil Harwood. But they were about 65 at that time. And Owen Barfield was just beginning to retire and beginning to write his own books. And he really, that was a prosperous period for him. He went lots and lots of trips to America. He wrote more then after he retired than even before. And the same worked for Cecil Harwood. Anyway, what they were happy to do was advise a younger person, namely me, but not do it themselves. So I turned out to be handy. But what I wanted to do was perhaps different from they might have done it, I don't know. But I was appalled when I went into Blackwell's bookshop and found right after Lewis died, his books were being remaindered. Not having that. No, his book should stay in print. But this goes back to one of the one argument that I had with C.S. Lewis, which he thought he won, but I know I won. No, you can understand it. He was worried about Warnie, and he said so one day. What is he going to live on when I die? He, C.S. Lewis. And I said, it's no mystery. He will live on your royalties. He said, but you see, what happens, when an author dies, is that about 3 years after he dies, his books stop selling after about 3 years. They just trail off to nothing. And I said, but yours won't. He said, sometime, the, author has a resurrection like Sir Walter Scott is having now. But he said, that's very, very rare. I said, you need work? He said, what is it about this American secretary knows what I don't? Why won't they stop selling? I said, because your books are so good and your readers are not that stupid. Well, would you be here if so anyway, but it was hard going. But I had learned from one of Lewis's publishers that if you bring out a new book, it helps bring out the old books. It helps sell the old books. So I tried this. I was working on the book that Lewis was working on himself, his poems, when he died. So I finished that book and brought it out on condition that the publisher bring back 2 old books. And then right after that, we changed publishers. And I was really worried about that because I was dealing with big Collins publishers who had been doing the paperbacks of Lewis all that time. And I had to go up and deal with them about Narnian stories, but I had also a new book of Lewis's. So I didn't know who I would be talking to, a faceless bureaucrat or maybe one of the Collins, Sir William, or his wife was involved in publishing too, Lady Collins. Anyway, I went up to London and they said, you're seeing Lady Collins. Well, I didn't like the sound of that. That sounded too grand for me. And I'd been brought up on cornbread. It didn't sound like a cornbread lady. And so anyway, I was ushered into her room, which was in a beautiful Queen Anne house. And there was a little fire in the grate. And all the furniture was covered in green velvet. And there was Lady Collins with a chihuahua on her lap, smoking a Sobrani, that's a Russian cigarette in a jade holder. I did not feel, I felt out of my depths, totally. And then in came the tea in Georgian silver plate, of course. Anyway, the thing about, I was praying all that time, Lord, give me courage in the face of all this. Because if Lady Collins had said, I want you to jump out the window, I would be first to jump. You couldn't do it fast enough for me. But she mentioned the new book, and I said, yes, but Lady Collins, it comes with a caveat, what is that? She said, I said, for every book that I give you of Lewis's, you must bring back 2 old books which have gone out of print. She said, very well. Which ones do you want to brought back? And I said, the Abolition of Man and the Pilgrim's Regress. Okay, fine. Which one do you want to publish first? And I said, Abolition of Man. She said, fine, I'll publish it if you just write the blurb on the back. So we got on very, very well together. but the women who ran the literary agency, they heard about this, this wonderful fortune. But they then approached me and said, you are too much under the spell of Lady Collins. But we're not. We are not ever under her spell. We know we've seen other men fall under that spell too. But we are immune. So if Lady Collins said, do you want any royalties from this? You would say, oh no, you keep it all. But we know better. So when it comes to business, only women are allowed to make the business deals with Lady Collins. So I was happy for that to happen. And anyway, we got on tremendously. I liked her so very, very much. and just really good friends. Uh, and then, so it continued on from that. I think one of the things that made a lot of difference to me, it may not sound very much to you, but at the same time that he was spending his last few years, and in 1962, the Second Vatican Council was meeting. It met for the first time in 1962. It was called by Pope John the 23rd. And in his opening address, he said something like this: the deposit of faith and the truths of our tradition are one thing, but the presentation of all that truth is another thing, but it must always bear the same sense and meaning. So, the gospel is one thing. Presenting the gospel, and however you do it, is another thing. But the gospel presentations must always bear the same sense and meaning as the gospel. Otherwise, you're just leaving the gospel alone. So how well has Lewis done it? Well, I mean, I think the Screwtape Letters is brilliant, wonderful. I mean, he gives everything, that is good and attractive and real and true to the enemy who is God. And what about the Narnian stories? Can anybody approach, or can anybody present Christ and more realistically than Aslan? Wonderful. I mean, sometimes one might learn to like Jesus through learning to love Aslan first. But anyway, the presentation of the gospel through the Narnian stories is very, very important. And Lewis, in all of his presentations, I think does it better than even the Pope could have imagined anybody doing it. So that meant a lot to me, and what I was pushing for was to find people who would give Lewis a chance. And I knew he had to have a new audience, because many of the old Anglicans whom he had known were turning up their backs on that. They were getting into modernism, and so was America. There was a man called Altizer in the United States who claimed God is dead. And this was even on Time magazine. So there was a lot of that. People were changing. But fortunately, during the Vatican Council, one of the decrees on ecumenism stated that there's truth in other religions as well. And we certainly should find it and treasure it, So many Catholics were reading Lewis for the first time. And especially, I mean, they found, abolition of man and the myth Christianity. I mean, that real missionary text to them. And when I had a visit, I was asked to go to an audience with John Paul II in 1984, and I think this was even more terrifying than meeting C.S. Lewis, but I knew he had read the Screwtape Letters to his students in 1950, because the biographies show that. And he had just, as soon as he became Pope, he mentioned in one of his addresses the Four Loves. And he said, it's of the significance with the writings of St. Augustine. So I knew he was very interested in that. And a young priest came to to England to see whether I was interested in meeting the Pope. But I said, I can't. Well, of course I am. I wish I could, but I have no way. And he said, no, but what I mean is, would you come? He wants you to come. So he then wrote from Rome, said, I don't think you really believed it. But yes, can't you spare at least 5 minutes for the Holy Father? So I said, yes, I'm coming. So I went there, and we had a wonderful conversation. He began by saying, do you still love your old friend C.S. Lewis? Which I thought a very pastoral thing to say. And I said, yes, I do, Holy Father, both storge and philia, friendship and eros, and agape. And he then wanted to talk about Lewis, what he was like. That's why I was there, actually, is to answer his questions. But I didn't feel that I could ask him any questions, because that's just not done. But at the end of the conversation, which was about 20 minutes, I think, in the end, he knew that I wanted to know what he thought of C.S. Lewis. So he said, C.S. Lewis knew what his apostolate was. And I thought, that's the end. But it wasn't the end. He said, and he did it. So after all, you may know, anybody might know what the apostolate is and not do it. But his point is that Lewis did it, And so I was thrilled to death, And he said to me, he had difficulty with my name. Walter Whooper, you are doing very good work. And I thought, does that mean I'm doing that well, what I'm doing, or that editing Lewis is better than editing Playboy? I hope it meant the first one. Anyway, I should stop and let you have it. But I will tell you the end of that conversation in Bratislava, the young 16-year-old girl who said, how does it feel having spent the whole of your life under the shadow of somebody else? And it's a different matter what did she actually mean. I'm not quite sure. But putting it that way, how does it feel having spent the whole of your life under the shadow of somebody else? Well, my answer was, wonderful. I wish I could do it all again. And that's the same, that if you ask me, that would be the same answer I would give you. Yeah.
One thing you said that struck me, and it's a personal experience, is that in some ways the Chronicles of Narnia are written in such a way that they give us another door to view and experience the Lord and everything. And one specific way I would say is, quite often I'm not in reading what Christ did for me. I believe it, but I've never responded that emotionally to it. But in reading it in the form of the Chronicles of Narnia, I experienced an emotional side that he allowed. And one thing specifically that I remember is when Aslan is going to the altar. And Lucy wants this love. She wants to touch him. But then she says, is he quite safe? And I thought that is such a beautiful thing, that this dichotomy of where we say the Lord loves us, and it's a personal relationship, but at the same time, he's the God of judgment. He's the God of creation. And so that these two things working at the same time. But I just thought that was a beautiful way to put
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
that, great
Yeah,
way.
yeah. Well, I think you would appreciate that. I was talking to Pauline Bain. She's the illustrator of both Tolkien and the Narnian stories. And she said that when she was drawing the pictures of Aslan being tormented and killed by the White Witch, she was just crying all the time. And, her picture was just being ruined by her tears. But anyway, when she could do it in a dry fashion, her heart was just broken. When she sent the drawings to Bless for the publication of, and then she said it was only after I'd drawn those pictures and was away from them that it occurred to me, of course I know who Aslan is. He's Christ. But this was exactly what should have happened. It worked on her. It got past her prejudices. And then she realized who it really was, But Lewis himself said that why is it that, whenever we think in terms of religious things, we think in almost like medical matters, But it's that if you could somehow strip away the stained glass appearance and somehow get past those watchful dragons which keep us from believing, then you've got a new, you start afresh.
It's almost like I'm knocking at the front door, and he comes up and says, I know I've heard you knocking. Follow me. I've got another way in.
Yes.
And that's what quite often the Chronicles of Narnia can do.
Well, Lewis was very good on prejudice. His brother Warnie tells the story of when Lewis was 8 years old, and the family together was going to France for holiday, and Lewis came down the day before and went into his father's study and sat, crossed his legs and fiddling with his thumbs, and he said to his father, I have a prejudice against the French. And father said, why? And Lewis said, if it was not a prejudice, I wouldn't have. If I just liked the French, it would not be a prejudice. But prejudice is, he knew, keeping him from liking people. And he knows that we have a prejudice against Christ. We just do. It's built up over many years. But how do you get rid of it, And I think the Narnia stories are the most successful attempt I've ever seen, I mean, once we have Christmas parties out here, and often the students of the C.S. Lewis Society of Oxford University come in, and if they read one chapter of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you can just see the prejudice falling off them, and they're all in love again with Aslan, But Aslan is more complicated than just saying it's Jesus, because Lewis explained to some school children, and this is volume 3 of the collected letters in America, that it's what I didn't do is I didn't take Jesus out of Nazareth and then turn him and put him into Narnia. No, I didn't go that route. What I did is the second person of the Trinity came down from heaven and became incarnate as a lion, as he had a man in this world. So instead of crossing over from Jesus of Nazareth being taken into Narnia, it's the second person of the Trinity coming down and becoming incarnate as a lion. That does make a big difference, you know. And he still gets many, many letters from children, and they're usually sent to me to answer. And some of those most charming letters I've ever seen. There's a little boy up in New England. I think he was about 6, and the teacher who sent the letter said, "This little boy knows that Mr. Lewis has died, but he insists on writing him anyway." And the little boy, Jake, began his letter, "Dear Mr. Lewis, I'm sorry you've died."
We'll have to put out a book of that.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
What is your favorite memory that you treasure of C.S. Lewis in the brief time that you were with him?
I think he was I had been saying, as C.S. Lewis has said, for so many years, I'm telling, everything I think really comes from C.S. Lewis. I really don't have any other source of enlightenment. Anyway, after I had come to know him, and he said, "Call me Jack," I kept saying, "But C.S. Lewis has said, 'Oh, but you are C.S. Lewis, aren't you?'" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, I am." And then he realized he could play that too. So he said, "As C.S. Lewis has said, I would like a pot of tea. As C.S. Lewis has said, you will go make it. As C.S. Lewis has said, I will drink it." So he played this game whenever he liked it. But he was so lovable. I mean, at the time he would say to me a lot of time, "You think too highly of my own works." And I said, "You don't think highly enough." But sometime when I was trying to praise him for a particular work, he would say, "Walter, what I think you're trying to say is thank you." Just thank you. But as regarded his own works, he seemed to have no opinion of them.
I know that your love of C.S. Lewis and his works and his essays and all the things of him as a person, you try to share that with the world
Yeah.
as much as possible. But did you ever imagine that what happened in 2013 at Westminster Abbey would happen, and just maybe some of your feelings or about that, that it did happen? Just, if you'd like to share that.
Yes. I was surprised. I think it should be there, but I knew when it was in the hands of Michael Ward, whom I have known for many, many years. It was in very, very good hands, and he made it happen, But it was deeply, deeply touching, to be in that great cathedral with Lewis's voice resounding around the. Were you there?
No,
Yeah.
I think you did.
And
Yes.
Will did.
and then the lessons were read by some of Lewis's pupils, like Francis Warner.
Someone was asking me the other day about Lewis's pupils. Now, is Francis Warner the only living pupil of C.S. Lewis that's left?
That I can't say that because Lewis has pupils who are not in touch, but they may be in touch with Maudlin. But he's the only one that has spoken up that we know. Is,
Right.
you know. But he was a pupil. He was actually his doctoral student.
Yes.
And of course, there's another one, Alistair Fowler.
Yes.
Who was supervised, his thesis was supervised by Lewis. So he wasn't a student except as a postgraduate.
Right.
So those are two. And there's a colleague called John Walsh, who is a little bit older than I am, who knew Lewis at Morden, Cambridge.
Right.
And he now teaches here, or was teaching here. So there are not many people left
Who knew him?
who knew him. There's Christopher Tolkien,
Right.
who's the only really old member, original member of the Inklings, and
He lives in France.
he lives in France. Yes. Mm-hmm.
But Priscilla is here in.
Yeah, that's right. She is. Mm-hmm. But she never had Lewis as a tutor. So the number of people who knew Lewis is very few now. You know.
So it's been a special privilege for us to be here with you today.
Well, thank you
to
so
have this
much for
opportunity
saying
to
that.
be
You
with
know.
someone who knew Lewis,
No,
which
no.
not many more people are going
No,
to have that
no.
opportunity.
Well, I think Lewis, one of his students who died, but a very nice student at Morden, he knew what it was like to argue with C.S. Lewis, and he said, to argue with C.S. Lewis was like entering a beauty contest. You had to be told, you had to be prepared to be told you were damned ugly.
Well, y'all there, you can continue to ask a few questions.